Hello, and welcome to Service Objects C# integration tutorial video. My name is Dylan, and I work here in our applications engineering team here at Service Objects. And we help out with all things related to tech support and product integration for our customers and prospective customers. Today we're going to go through a step-by-step tutorial to illustrate some key steps in the process of using a Service Objects dots validation product while programming in C#. In order to participate in this tutorial, you'll need a few things. The first is a basic knowledge of C# and object-oriented programming. The second is Visual Studio or some other IDE. And the third is a dots validation product license key. You can get a free trial key at www.serviceobjects.com. For this example, we'll be using our dots email validation 3 web service. This service performs real-time checks on email addresses to determine if they are genuine, accurate, and deliverable. The service performs over 50 tests on a given email address to determine whether or not it can receive mail or whether it's valid. After the checks are performed, our service will rate an email on a score from 0, meaning definitely a good email, to a score of 4, meaning definitely a bad email. If you need verification for emails in real time, this service is for you. If you are interested in a different service, you can still follow along in this tutorial with your service of choice. The process will be the same, but the outputs, inputs, and objects that we'll be dealing with in this integration video will be slightly modified. Now to start, we'll go ahead and launch Visual Studio. I have it in my toolbar here, so I'm just going to select that. And once it loads, we'll select a new project. And here we're going to select ASP.NET Web Application. Now this is just for this tutorial that we're doing. For your applications, you can obviously use a console application, a WPF application, a Windows Form application, pretty much anything that will call a web service. But just for demonstration purposes, we're going to call or create a very simple ASP.NET Web application. Here, go ahead and give it a applicable name. Call ours C# tutorial. Create it, and once this pops up, we're going to go ahead and select empty to have an empty web application. And once everything is finished loading, we'll see here that we have an empty web application. And the first thing that we're going to do in our brand new application is right-click the project, select Add, and then select Web Form. And this web form we'll use to take in the inputs from our user and send them to the Ev3 validation service. We're going to go ahead and give it a pretty simple name, input form here, and click OK. And we can see that indeed input form.aspx has been added to our project. So on this ASPX page, we're going to go ahead and add a few items that will take in our inputs and send them to the code behind page. I already have the HTML necessary elements in my clipboard, so I'm just going to paste that in, and then I'll talk about some of the elements. So here we're using divs to create a pretty simple table. You can see the different class headings here for each of the divs. So it says table, row, cell, etc. We have 3 inputs. So one is email address. That's where we'll enter in the email address that we're sending to the service. And to take in that input, we have an ASP text box. And we have allow corrections, which is another input to the email validation 3 service. This is also a text box. And our last input that we will send to this service is timeout. And we'll talk about what these values mean later. For right now, all we need to know is that we have text boxes that will take the values and send them to the background of the service. And we also have an ASP button here called Ev3. It's called Call Ev3. And we'll use that to signal the event that says we want to actually call the service from the code behind. Some other things that we have here are a status label, which we'll use to tell the user whether or not an error was returned from the service or a valid response was returned. And we'll have an output grid, which we'll use to actually display the results. And we have a few formatting things here in the table to make it stand out a little bit. And here below is some of our very simple CSS definitions. And now that we have successfully defined all our input and output elements, I'm going to go ahead and press Control F5, and we're going to launch this in Firefox just to take a quick peek at what it looks like. And here you'll see that we have a really simple title. We have a really simple table that we've created using divs, and we have our button that will signal to the web page that we actually want to call the email validation 3 web service. And now we're going to go through the process of adding an actual service reference to the project. So to do this, first we'll need to go to trial.serviceobjects.com, and we'll navigate over to the .email validation 3 service right here. Click. And then from here, you're going to select service description. And we're going to copy this WSDL URL. Let's go back to Visual Studio. To add a service reference, we'll right-click Reference, Add Service Reference. We'll paste in the URL, select Go. And here we can see that Visual Studio was able to consume the WSDL and was able to find the Ev3 library. And we're just going to make sure this is HTTPS when we consume it, though. So redo that, and we'll name it Ev3 to give it a pretty simple name, and select OK. And you can see that Visual Studio has successfully added Ev3 as the web service here. A quick note, if you are using Visual Studio, we recommend that you use the service reference here. It'll do all the heavy lifting and create all the necessary input and output elements for you, and all the necessary classes and objects that you'll need to process the response and actually call the web service. If you are using an older version of the .NET framework, you might actually have to add a web reference, and you can do that by clicking this Advanced tab in the Add Service Reference. And select this button down here called Add Web Reference. The process of calling and using a response from a web reference is very similar to using a service reference. Another thing to note is that if you are using another web service, you can find the WSDL here for each of the web services that we have available. So for instance, if you go here for .address validation 3 and click the same service description button, you can find the WSDL here for our address validation 3 service. And we're now ready to go into the code behind file and put in the actual code that will make the call to the email validation 3 web service. The first thing we'll add in our page load method is to make sure to set the visible fields to false for both our status label and our output grid. So after do that, the next thing we're going to do is add a little try catch block. And then the catch will catch any exception just for debugging purposes and let us know if we did anything wrong while calling our web service. So here we'll make the status label .text equal to whatever the message was, and on a new line in the status label, if I can type it right, will be the stack trace as well. And so we can see what we did wrong. We'll see set the visible flag to true. And within this try block, we're going to instantiate 3 things. The first one is going to be a string that we're going to call license key. And from here, we're going to pull something from our web config, which we don't add. We'll add the using statement in a second, and we're going to call that the same thing in the web config. The next 2 objects we're going to create are the Ev3 library client. So we can go to right here, select that. We'll call it Ev3 service equal new. And we will instantiate the response object, which will display the results from the service. And we'll just call that response to keep it simple. Another thing that is helpful for us to know is that when we create this Ev3 library client, we can actually pass in a string here that will correspond to certain endpoints that are in the web config file. When we added a service reference to the project, Visual Studio automatically added an endpoint here that points to the .email validation 3 web service. If you're using a production key, you would want two of these. One that would point to ws.serviceobjects.com and one that would point to wsbackup.serviceobjects.com. And the reason for this is that this will ensure that your application continues to run in the event that our primary servers are experiencing issue or behaving strangely or anything like that. But for now, and for this example, we're just going to leave it at trial.serviceobjects.com. And we'll actually name this one primary. We'll name this one backup. And we'll show in a second how to add the appropriate logic to call these two endpoints. And another thing we're going to do in the web config is add an app settings section. And in here, we're going to go ahead and add our license key. And the value will be WS, and you can just put in your license key here. It should follow that format. And so when we go back here and read it in, it'll read in the string of the license key. And the reason we put it in the web config is that when you're using a trial key, your trial key will be different from your production key. So having it in the web config can allow you to switch from a trial to a production environment very quickly, and it would only need a web config change as opposed to redeploying code or anything like that. And so in here, in the Ev3 library client, we're going to pass in the text primary, and that'll know to use this whatever binding contract is in the web config here with the name primary, and so it'll call this endpoint. And again, if you were using a production environment, this would point to ws.serviceobjects.com. Now that we've dealt with all the web config settings, we're going to go ahead and make the call to the Ev3 Web Service. To do this, first we're going to do a try catch block, and this will allow us to call our backup URL in the event that there's an issue calling the primary URL. So to make the actual call, it's actually very simple. You're going to set the response object, which we've named response, to the Ev3 service, and from here you're going to choose the validate email address operation. This is our recommended operation, but if you want to use another one, you're welcome to, if that would better suit your business application. And from here, we're just going to take the text that is entered into our input form and send it directly to the service. If you are using this in a live environment, like a live web form, you'd probably want to do some cleanup on the email address that gets sent in to make sure that it looks good or remove any white space. The email validation 3 service does a very good job actually of doing things like that, but it's always for the best. It's always better to send the cleaner data if you have the option. And we're going to go ahead and put our license key here. And directly after we call the validate email address operation, we're going to do what we call our failover check. And we'll have an if statement that says if response is equal to no, or if response dot error is not equal to null, and response if I can get it there, dot error dot type code is equal to 3. And if these conditions are met, we want to throw a new exception that will be caught by this catch block down here. And in this catch block, we'll take our Ev3 service and set it equal to a new instance of the Ev3 library client. And in here, we're going to pass the backup string, which will point to our backup environment that we've defined in our web config. And we can actually just copy and paste this method And we'll call it here and leave it like that. So another note about this logic here, what we've called the failover check. First, we check to see if the response is null. If it is null, that means something seriously went wrong with the web service. It's down or something like that. Or we check for the fact that the error is not null and the responsive type code is equal to 3, which indicates a fatal error from the service object's web service. If you're implementing this in a live environment, you probably want to have some type of logging here that logs when you see this error, so that you can send it to our support team and we'll investigate it as quickly as we can. So in the code here, after our calls to the Ev3 Web Service, we'll want to do something with the response that we get back. And so what we're going to do in this example is check to make sure the error response is not null. And if we do in fact find an error response, we will call a method called process error response. And that'll take the response object as an input. And we'll actually create these methods in a second. So if an error response is not present, that means there was a valid response from the web service. So we will process a valid response in the event that one is returned from the service, and that'll take the same object as an input. And I've already had this created, but if you go ahead and press Control period here in Visual Studio, you can select the option to generate the response, which is pretty nice. And you can just remove that exception here. Now that we actually have both our methods defined, we'll put in the code that will process the response and add it to a data table, and then bind that data table to our output grid ASP element that we defined earlier. Now I have this in my clipboard right here, so I'm going to paste it in, and then press Control period to make Visual Studio add the using system.data. And once I do that, everything should, gotta undo that. So now that I've done that, we'll walk through a little bit of what we've done here. So first we create a data table named valid response and add 2 columns to it, outputs and values. And then we add a row to this data table for each response element in the email validation 3 object. So you can see the different fields here that we can access via the response object, and we've just simply added what that field is and what the value is here. And so for our output grid.data source, we're going to give it a new data view with the valid response data table as an input. We're going to bind that to the output grid, and then we're going to make the output grid visible is equal to true. And then in our status label, we'll set that text equal to valid response from the Ev3 Web Service. And we'll make sure that it's visible as well. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and copy in the code to the process error response. And that'll do pretty much the exact same thing, but it'll just display an error that came back from the service. To test our project, we're going to go ahead and launch it in Firefox. And to do that, we'll hit the Run button up here. Visual Studio will automatically launch Firefox. And we'll see our input form here. And to show a couple examples of the service, we'll enter in support@serviceobjects.com. The allow corrections field we'll set to true. And for our timeout value, we'll set that to 10 seconds, and this value is in milliseconds. We're going to hit call Ev3 Web Service, and we'll see that we got a response back from the service. The score that the service returned for the email was 0, meaning that it is definitely a good email. We got the is deliverable flag of true. The same email address for the email address in and email address out. And this email corrected flag was false because this service didn't need to correct the email address. A couple interesting things to note is that the service was able to append 2 note codes to our note code section. So first is that it's a role, meaning that there's a few people that will receive emails if you send an email to this email address. And the last is that it's a business address, which would make sense because it's a service objects email address. So let's do another example where we see the correction flag in operation. So if we do service objects.vom instead of com and hit enter, we'll see that the service changed this email corrected flag to true, and the email address out was service objects.com. And let's see what happens when we set this to false. And we'll see here that the service doesn't try to change the email address, just takes it as it is and does its checks and its logic on it and determines that it is indeed bad because .vom does not exist. And we get a bunch of warning descriptions here saying unrecognized top-level domain, which would make sense. Invalid DNS, email is bad, subsequent checks halted. Another thing to note here is the timeout value. And we have this timeout value because certain domains can take longer to verify and interact with. Most domains provide a very quick and easy response to our service, and we can confirm whether or not they are valid or whether or not they're good. But some of them take a little bit longer to interact with. And so what this timeout value essentially sets is the max time that our service will try to communicate with whatever given email address is given to it. And that is it for our C# integration tutorial video. If you have any questions or requests or anything like that, please feel free to email us at support@serviceobjects.com, and we will gladly answer any questions that you may have.